Beatrice de Graaf studied modern history and German at Utrecht University and in Bonn. She received her PhD degree in December 2004 in Utrecht with a thesis entitled Across the Wall, the German Democratic Republic, the Dutch Churches and the Peace Movement, for which she received the Max van der Stoel Human Rights Prize. She worked as assistant professor at the Department of International History at Utrecht University. In 2007, she helped to establish the Center for Terrorism and Counterterrorism of the campus The Hague of Leiden University, where she is appointed full professor of conflict and security history in 2012. De Graaf has published Evaluating Counterterrorism Performance, a comparative study at Routledge, on the motives, practices and effectiveness of security measures in Italy, Germany, the Netherlands and the United States within an international comparative perspective, and a book called Dangerous Women in Holland, Gevaarlijke, vrouwen, on terrorism perpetrated by women. She's a member of the editorial board of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Perspectives on Terrorism, Journal of European Intelligence Studies, and the Zeitschrift für Auswärtige und Sicherheitspolitik. She publishes widely on terrorism and security issues. Mrs. de Graaf, as an expert on terrorism and counterterrorism, you have introduced the factor of performativity in terrorism studies. Departing from the idea that terrorism is theater, you suggest that both terrorism and counterterrorism, from state perspective, their effectiveness should be measured not on the material impact, but the efficiency with which they get their message across. This introduces a specifically artistic dimension in the concept of terrorism, something that has already been noticed by artists in the wake of 9/11. Could you perhaps elaborate on this notion of performativity and its pertinence to the case that we have in front of us?
We are reviewing the case of Professor Sisson today, and what I think makes this case so special is the fact that it pertains to someone, to a suspect from the Philippines, to purported crimes carried out in the Philippines, and to a citizen of the Philippines, but to a trial which is staged here in the Netherlands, to crimes which have not been committed at all, which have not been committed in the Netherlands, not against the Netherlands. So there's a huge cleavage between what Mr. Sisson has been accused of and where and how he is accused. So in the case of Sisson, I would suggest that we are witnessing the performative effect, not so much of terrorism. You could both look at terrorism as an act, a performative act, as a theater thing, but you could also look at counterterrorism as a form of theater, as a performative aspect. And today I would like to share with you some thoughts on the performative aspect, not of terrorism, but of counterterrorism. Counterterrorists are stage players as well. They also produce theater. And in the case of Professor Sisson, we are witnessing the performative effect of the war on terror in its most far-reaching form. A form that not only affects Mr. Sisson, but also affects the rule of law of the Netherlands, a country that has nothing to do with the People's Army at all. Over the past decade, European countries have severely criticized the US for their extra-legal war on terror and their persistent use of military repressions, for example in the form of drones. However, I think it's time to review the way European democracies deal with terrorism as well, perhaps not through wars or through drones, but through legal means, which makes it the more subtle and the more dangerous, perhaps even more dangerous than blank-out war, because we can see war in progress, we can judge war, and we can condemn it. But how about those legal measures that we have been discussing so far? Who really knows everything about those legal measures, except for Jan Vermon and Mr. Van Dam? I must admit that I always forget the legal paragraphs in Dutch law, so I challenge you to go home or use your tablet, read through the Dutch Penal Code, because that's the most important thing that supports and undermines our democracy in the Netherlands. So rather than keeping your eyes out in the United States or Iraq and Afghanistan, please go home and study your penal code and study the small articles in the newspaper about, for example, the extradition of Sabir K. So let me give you 3 thoughts on the performative aspect of this legal war on terrorism as it is being waged in the Netherlands as we speak. First, I will like to address this performative aspect in more depth. Second, I will address a trial, a terrorism trial, as an instrument of risk management. And third, I will make some evaluative remarks in the end. So first, the performative power of a terrorism trial as the most important element of a very important element in the legal war against terror. In debates on preemptive measures and the war on terror, criminal law is often regarded as the better way in dealing with terrorism, not just, as I said, through drones and military means, but through trials. But terrorism trials, they are it's a very serious business. Law is productive of reality, symbolic orders, and power. And trials are the very spaces, the theatrical spaces in a real theatrical sense, where these productions are enabled and contested. So the terrorism trial is sort of a black box. Before that, you have political behavior, then it goes through the black box of a trial, and in the end, you have something criminal. So someone changes through a terrorism trial from being an ordinary citizen to someone without any status at all, to a refugee or to a convicted felon. And it is during actual terrorism trials that the meaning and the scope of new juridical provisions, such as those laid down in the EU lists and the framework decisions, are made real. So in court, the purported crime and its object are enacted, evoked by the prosecution. The prosecutor is an actor. He has a story to tell. He acts his piece out. It's either accepted or rejected by the defense and judged then by the jury or judge. The public might be present, as are the media, rendering the trial a veritable theater of performance. You can all remember perhaps the trials meted out against the Hofstad group, for example. There was a huge media presence there, and more often than not, suspects are already convicted in the media before the trial takes place. The understanding of a trial's performance, it's not something I invented. It goes back to the pre-modern age when trials were really very much theater shows. The perpetrator was put on a scaffold. He was cut in 4 halves, for example, cut in 4 parts. He was receiving bodily punishment in full view of all the spectators. The aim of these performances was not to carry out worldly justice alone, but to demonstrate the fate of the sinners. And these trials acted as a memento mori and a demonstration of how the gates of hell would open for anyone that trespassed against divine and human rule. Trials were a theater of horror. They were intended to inflict horror upon the hearts and the souls of the onlookers. Well, since then, on the one hand, trials have lost their dramatic quality. People are not punished in full view. However, I would argue they still are very performative. I understand terrorism trials as a performative space in which reality is shaped, is established, and where new punishments and new sinners, so to speak, are produced, and where new divine powers, international powers, are acted out. How does that happen? Well, the law in action is a communicative process, and it also offers a framework to interpret human action and communication. Trials are a medium through which communication takes place, but they are also production sites of new meaning, and this is especially true for terrorism trials. Both for the suspects as for the security forces, public presentation, contestation of narratives of justice and injustice are especially important. Of course, there's also normal trials against murderers, for example, but it's not so much a trial on competing ideas of justice. The murderer has murdered someone, and he doesn't want to make a show for a different system of justice, for example. Or a thief has stolen something. He doesn't want to make a case for a new kind of justice. But a terrorist, someone who has been defined as a terrorist, is per definition someone who challenges the current political system and offers a new vision of justice. So what is at stake at the trial of Mr. Sisson, is competing images, competing ideas of justice. And counterterrorism is communication of will. So the crime of terrorism is essentially a political and a contested concept, and a terrorism trial is thus a political dispute. This performative aspect of a terrorism trial considers trials as the stage where these political contestations play out, where narratives of justice are established, where the positions are enacted, overthrown, or confirmed. And this show element provides the authorities with the platform to address, for example, popular demands for putting terrorist suspects on trial or American demands for putting terrorists on trial. However, trials can also become a space, it's not just a negative story I want to tell you, they also can become a space in which the legitimacy of the actions of police and security forces can be contested and overthrown. They can also be a space where the defendant can successfully defend his case. So the space of the terrorism trial can become a site where an alternative vision of justice is produced. Still, I think in current terrorism trials there are three problematic aspects. Of course, first of all, if a trial occurs after a real terrorist attack, I mean, when a real bomb has gone off, for example, and the system of justice invoked then by the formal trial has to deal with the explicit claim to justice stated by the terrorist, suspected terrorist, previous to the trial. Terrorism trial competes with his system of justice. So the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury have to deal not with a crime, but a political statement as well. And they have to try to legitimize their system of justice and to delegitimize his. So they have to do more than just reproduce laws of society. They have to defend them against this other claim of justice. But it's much more problematic, the second aspect, if the trial occurs before an actual attack or without an actual attack takes place. If a terrorist suspect is apprehended without a real attack, without something really happened, a trial becomes a virtual show. There is no smoking gun, there are only rumors, allegations, associations, lists, deliberations, tapped conversations, and there are no victims. And the state steps into the position of the victim because the suspected terrorist purportedly attacked the state system. But where is the victim laying dead? So it's hard to convict a suspect for something that only exists in conjecture and in future projections. The third aspect, which is very problematic for these performative trials, is if a trial is being held within the context of a still prevailing threat. Look at the Hofstadgroep trials. Alexander van Dam did his very best, and the suspects were convicted. Then they were overthrown. Then they were convicted again. And 3 out of the 13 suspects today, those higher appeals have been overturned by the High Court as we speak. So that's not Alexander's fault, that's not the case I want to make. But the changing climate, the changing political climate also changes the mindset of the judges, of the High Court. And if no attack has taken place yet, then how do we judge that someone is a terrorist or not? And it also very much depends on the political climate and the political pressure within a given society. And that can change overnight. So that's very important. Trials do not take place in a vacuum. Criminal law is not an absolutist entity. It has to be filled with new meaning, and it is every time anew. So this brings me to my second point. What then is the function of such a trial when there's no habeas corpus, when there's no body with a knife in it? Well, terrorism trials more often than not are instruments of risk management. Think back, what's the function of a trial? Why do we need trials in a democracy? Well, of course, classical truth-finding, who did it? Deterrence to the criminal, prevention perhaps, also restoration of social order, retribution, rather than killing each other, we allow the state to do that. Those are the classical functions of the rule of law, of trials within a democratic society. What then is the function of a terrorism trial? Well, I would argue more often than not it's risk management, sheer risk management. And if we take the case of José María Sison, his trial, was that about truth-finding? Yes, in fact it was. It was first of all about the question whether or not he did participate in the assassinations of Rómulo Quintana, Arturo Tabara and Stephen Ong. Yes, but there were no witnesses to be found. Still the trial went on. So was his trial then about deterrence, to deter Mr. Sison from further crimes? Was it about retribution? No, because it was highly unlikely that any terrorism suspect in the Philippines, members of his party, would be deterred from possible attacks by a trial taking place in the Netherlands. nor would any terrorism suspect harboring plans in that direction in the Netherlands be withheld from his or her plans by such a trial. At best, he or she would seek, for example, refuge in another European country. So then, did the Dutch public prosecutor initiate a trial for reasons of retribution? No, Mr. Sisson did nothing against the Netherlands. Did he do it for the Philippines? Perhaps. The only reason the Netherlands started the investigation prosecution was for reasons of humanity, because rather than extraditing Sisson to a country where he would be tortured or killed, the Dutch authorities decided, as was their claim, to prosecute Sisson here. Perhaps, but there was also the second function. It was a show of solidarity and support for the international war on terror as launched by the US administration. And in this sense, the terrorism trial against Sisson was an instrument of risk management, not even primary risk management. Sisson was not a threat for the Dutch legal order of society, but he was an alleged suspect from a Philippine or US perspective only. So the Dutch authorities decided to support this perspective, perform their show of international solidarity in the war on terror through this trial. So the Dutch were the workhorse, as someone defined it, for the US. So the trial against Sisson was a performative one. It was a trial, not just a ritual restating Dutch traditions or conventions. It was a performance. It was referential in the sense that it generated new meaning. It tried to define Sisson as an international terrorist who was exerting influence on a global scale and who had to be combated within the international legal order. And by premediation on behalf of the Philippine government, images of impending doom were produced once Sisson would be acquitted. So this brings me to the last remarks. Evaluation, we have to ask ourselves whether the trial against Sisson does imply a turn towards the militarization and the securitization of justice. So rather than the EU waging a war against terrorism, we are waging a war through legal means. And that might affect democratic rule of law as such. Well, I have argued that Sisson's trial was performative in the sense that it tried to create a new reality in defining Sisson as an international terrorist. We have moreover established that the aims of trying Sisson lay more in the impossibility to extradite him, on the one hand, and the attempt to support the American-Philippine war on terror on the other. However, when Sisson was removed from the UN terrorism list in 2007 and again in 2009, and no incriminatory evidence was found, the case for the prosecution fell away. The performative power of this particular terrorism trial was neutralized by the delisting procedure started by Sisson and his lawyers and enforced by the European Court. So, 3 last sentences. First, terrorism trials always run the risk of supporting a permanent emergency state and becoming an instrument of risk management, thereby undermining democratic legal order. In sentencing terrorism suspects without a habeas corpus, state prosecutors have to rely on hearsay intelligence and premediation, but in some cases, these reliances might undermine the right to a fair trial. Second, however, this is the positive remark, system of justice has been apt to deal with terrorism suspects. Better than we think, perhaps, all things considered. Through the series of court proceedings, appeals and procedures, one-dimensional political definitions of terrorism apparently still can be overturned by law itself. Sisson has been acquitted for lack of evidence and the prosecution has terminated the case. So, third remark, trials do not restore breaches in society, they make them explicit. And this is my plea for more trials, more open trials for us to know more and read more about such trials. It is an institutionalized way of discussing conflicting concepts of justice and different ideas about security. Trials are open-ended theater plays, open-ended narratives on justice and injustice, in which not only the state has its say, but also the defendants, and also public pressure groups, media attention, human rights organizations. So, terrorism trials can remain places where confronting stories of justice are presented and upheld, and in this sense, terrorism trials are performative, but they can be performances of justice, as long as we all pay very close attention. Thank you.